There it is. Okay, Jim, take it away.
Thank you so much, Chris. Representative Munns, I'm not sure how people recognize you here, but many thanks to you and all those involved for hosting this five-part series on education. Education, I think we can all agree. I think everyone can agree of how important education is. The pathway to get to adequate education, though, may take a few different routes, and we may then have some disagreements. And in those disagreements, I think education has come under an enormous amount of pressure over the last few years. So tonight, in this fourth series that we have, we're going to be talking about school funding inequities. This being the fourth in this series, the first three, we had the threats to public education in New Hampshire, teachers and curriculum under attack, and efforts to undermine school and weaken our democracy. I think we can all also agree that there are threats to
What
our
are those
public
sentences? And
education.
who are you saying them to?
And I myself, I am a state representative from here in Northampton. Again, I am Jim Maggiore. I have been here in Northampton for going on 30 years. All three of my children have gone through the Northampton Elementary School. They've matriculated up to Winnicott High School. They've all received excellent educations. They've gone on to private colleges. One has graduated with her master's degree. The other is, I have another one who's a junior and another one who is a sophomore. And I just really enjoy watching them learn, but learning again, I'm going to go back to how I started this before I turn it over, has come under many, many threats lately. And that's why we're so happy to have Noah Tulersky with us this evening from the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project to talk about these threats to the funding that allows for our kids to learn in the best way possible and to matriculate and become the best that they can be. The mission of the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project is to inform the public about the condition of New Hampshire public schools and their funding, and of course to advocate for changes and make the system more equitable for students and taxpayers alike. Noah, who is a hometown boy or a home state boy, growing up in Nashua, he went off to Georgetown University, where he got his degree in government and economics. Is really working is really doing the wonderful work to help us, help our children, help our families, and help our communities get the best they can out of public education. And anybody who's watching the news right now knows, and I can't emphasize it enough, the threats to public education. So all that said, just before I turn it over to Noah for this evening's presentation, just like to say, as we're going along, there may be many, many, many questions we would ask. If you could please put those questions in the chat, and at the end of the 30 to 40-minute presentation that Noah will give, we'll get to all those questions. You may have something that's burning in your mind right now that 3 seconds later, Noah hits that and the question is answered. Please just put the questions in the chat and we'll get to as many and hopefully all of them as possible. And we'll be respectful of your time and try to do this in just about an hour. So with that said, I'd like to turn this over to our special guest this evening, Noah Tulersky. Take it away, Noah.
Thank you, Representative Maggiore, and thank you everyone for having me this evening. Let me get my slides going. I know that this was advertised to be Zach Sheehan presenting. He's our executive director, but we had to do some last minute shuffling, and Zach is giving a presentation at the Oyster River School Board this evening. So we had to swap around a little bit to make sure we could cover all of these opportunities to talk to people. Like Representative Maggiore said, I'm Noah Tulersky. I'm the communications manager for the New Hampshire School Funding Fairness Project. The project is a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit organization working to educate people about school funding in New Hampshire. and how it affects a lot of aspects of our lives. I did grow up in Nashua. I moved home after college. I still live in Nashua. So I am a longtime New Hampshire resident. I went to Nashua Public Schools, played sports against some Winnicott teams when I was in high school, and really do care about my public education and the opportunities that it allowed me to have. So I'm going to jump right in, try and keep this moving right along because I do have a lot of slides and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So the main points that I'm going to try and hit tonight are that taxpayers and students are not treated equitably or fairly under our current system, that the problem is getting worse, and that the current system is unconstitutional. So we're going to go through all of these three things, not necessarily in that order. So we're going to start with an example. Public high school A here. Looking at these numbers, it's a pretty good high school. Obviously, these are average numbers about student performance. In any school district, you're going to have high achievers, students who are struggling, but averages can tell us a lot generally about what a high school is like. About 17 miles down the road from public high school A, we have public high school B. And as you'll see, their scores are not quite as good. They have fewer students who are testing at or above proficiency in math and reading. Instead of 97% of students graduating in 4 years, it's only 81%. They don't have as many students taking AP tests scoring a 3 or above. That's the level at which students can earn college credit, usually with an AP score. Their teachers are making about $30,000 less per year on average. The community's median household income is about $20,000 lower. And their education property taxes, instead of $4.70 per thousand, it's $11.24 per thousand. And on a $350,000 home, they pay about double the taxpayers in the community of public high school A is. So these are two real schools in your neck of the woods. Portsmouth High is public high school A, and Somersworth High School is public high school B. And these sorts of disparities and discrepancies happen all over the state. This is not isolated to just Portsmouth and Somersworth or, Claremont and Hanover High School. You can find these sorts of differences all around the state. And it sort of leads into this this idea that was really hammered home by the 2020 Legislative Commission to Study School Funding, that the state's current system is inequitable from student and taxpayer perspectives, and the districts with the least property wealth have the highest education property tax rates, and that there is a negative relationship between aggregated student outcomes and student poverty, which was measured by free and reduced price lunch eligibility. I saw Representative Mel Myler join the call. I believe Representative Myler was a member of that commission. Correct me if I'm wrong. I apologize if that's incorrect. But this commission did a lot of really good work on studying the current state of school funding in New Hampshire and made a lot of recommendations, which unfortunately have not all come to pass in the legislatures that have come since this commission released its report. So the problem with having such a high reliance on tax rates and having local tax rates have such a big impact on students' educational outcomes is because local property taxes are the single largest part of school revenue in New Hampshire. About 61% of all school district revenue comes from local property taxes. And then going around the pie here, this lighter blue section that's labeled SWEPT, that is the statewide education property tax. We've made that a similar color to the local property tax because currently, even though it is a state tax, SWEPT is collected and retained locally. So it's just another line item on your regular municipal tax bill. The cities and towns collect it and then they hold on to the money. The state never touches it. So it is essentially another local property tax. So 70% of school revenue is coming from local property taxes, excuse me. About 5% comes from the lottery. We just sort of split that out because people have this idea that the lottery is going to pay for all education, which all lottery revenues after prizes are paid out and after the salaries of the lottery staff are paid, that's what everything that's left goes to the Education Trust Fund. It was about $185 million this past calendar year. We have some other state aid, state adequacy aid, federal, and food and tuition. But the main story that this pie chart really shows is that 70% of school funding comes from local sources, and only about 20% is coming from the state. So how did we get here? How did we end up in this situation today? So we're going to go back to the 1990s. Actually, we're going to go back even before I was born. To the Claremont lawsuit. So in the 1990s, Stevens High School in Claremont was on the verge of losing its accreditation. They were struggling to provide the education that their students needed. So Claremont and a group of other districts, as well as some taxpayers and even a handful of students, sued the state in the 90s, demanding that they be given additional funding so they could actually get the education that their students needed. And they won. Which I'm sure you're familiar with, took a couple years, but there were two major decisions that came out of Claremont. The first one is that the state of New Hampshire has a duty to pay for the cost of a constitutionally adequate education for every K-12 student. And the taxes that the state uses to pay for this education must have a uniform rate across the state. So these are the two main takeaways from Claremont, and these have been the building blocks for a number of other Supreme Court decisions since then. But you might say to yourself, what exactly does constitutionally adequate mean? Adequate is not a very descriptive word. The court, while they didn't define adequate education and ultimately left that responsibility up to the state legislature, did give us a bit of a guidepost in their decision about what they thought it meant to have an adequate education. And I won't read this whole slide because it's kind of long, but it's a pretty broad and comprehensive definition of education. The court was looking at, the expansion of computer technology and the expansion of the internet, and seeing a economy that was becoming more global, more interconnected, and wanted to ensure that students were had the tools they needed to compete in that growing global economy, that we had well-rounded students who were leaving New Hampshire public schools. So what happened after this massive decision? One of the big things that happened was the SWEPT, like I talked about before, the statewide education property tax. Originally, it had a $6.04 rate per thousand that was levied around the state, and it was used to help provide the new adequacy aid funding that the state was giving to local districts, adequacy aid funding and adequate education. And even though there was a creation of a new property tax, around the state, the average property tax that was being paid by property owners decreased to by about $4 from the year 1998 to the year 1999 when SWEPT was introduced. So this was a pretty massive change for a lot of communities around the state, because all of a sudden their tax rate has been cut, and it's a lot easier for them to be able to keep their rates down and raise the money that their schools need to educate their students. But it has not all been good since Claremont. So while we had the SWEPT right off the bat, a coalition of property wealthy towns lobbied and ultimately won to get the state to change SWEPT to the way it is now, where communities keep all of the money that they raise, as opposed to sending the money to the state for the state to distribute it. As a result of that, there are some parts of the state that have negative tax rates. They don't pay any education tax rates, and that includes some pretty valuable properties like the Balsams Resort up north. It's mostly places where there's not really any students, but it's a $280 million in property value that is going untaxed to support the state's responsibility to fund education. A couple years later, the courts ruled again that the legislature had to define an adequate education, and it reaffirmed the idea that whatever the state defined as an adequate education, it had to pay for. There was a legislative study commission in 2008 as a result of this decision. And then in the last decade, the burden on local property taxpayers to fund education has increased by a lot, 614 million, whereas the funding that the state is providing has increased by less than $50 million in that same amount of time. So let's talk about today. Oh, well, there's one more. These are the commissions, the major commissions, 2008 after the Londonderry decision, the 2020 commission that we quoted from earlier. And there's been a lot of study of this issue since the Claremont rulings have happened. So let's talk about today. What is the state providing for an adequate education? So the state introduced adequacy aid in the aftermath of Claremont to fulfill its responsibility to fund an adequate education. The way it works is every student in the state, the school district receives $4,100 in base adequacy. This is the amount of money that the state says you can educate the least expensive child for. So this is a child who has no special needs, does not need additional resources. That gets paid out to every student in the state. And then there's a few categories for differentiated aid. These are groups of students that the state has determined it is more expensive to educate them, and they need additional resources to be able to achieve at the same level as students who are only receiving base adequacy. So that includes students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. And I want to be clear that that is not to pay for the lunch program. That is for additional resources that low-income students might need to achieve at the same level as higher income students, and the state just uses free and reduced price lunch as a way to measure students and families' income levels. There's $800 for every student who's an English language learner, and $2,300 for each student receiving special education services. One problem with that is the average cost of special education services in the state of New Hampshire on top of regular education services is about $27,000 per pupil with an IEP, an individualized education plan. So you add all these up together and we get an average of $5,148 per pupil. That is what the state says you can educate the average student in New Hampshire for. But that doesn't come nearly close to what districts are actually spending to educate their students. So the state average, it's about $20,000, it's over $20,000 per pupil. So the state's adequacy contribution is about 25% of what it actually costs to educate a student. What you can see here, the green bars are what's actually being spent on education, and the shorter bars is the state's contribution. Here we are giving the state credit for SWEPT because the state takes credit for SWEPT. And then whatever the state says district needs to provide in adequacy aid, the state levies SWEPT, and whatever is left between what SWEPT raises and what a district needs to fulfill the state's adequacy number, the state provides a grant to make up the difference. And you'll notice here that Hampton and Northampton are not receiving any adequacy grant from the state. That's because what they raise from the SWEPT is greater than what the state says they need in terms of funding for an adequate education. But before I get into that, I just want to reiterate how big the gap is between what the state says is adequate and what districts have actually determined they need to spend on students. So the reason that Hampton and Northampton, but I just have Hampton numbers on this slide. The reason that Hampton does not receive any adequacy grant, like I said, is because they collect more from the SWEPT than the state says they need to fund an adequate education. So if you subtract the cost of an adequate SWEPT from the cost of an adequate education, Hampton in this school year is having about $121,000 in excess SWEPT. So that's excess money that the school district retains and must spend on education-related expenses. Before the change to SWEPT, about in 2011, 2008, 2011, before that, that $120,000 would be going to the state and would be remitted to other school districts as part of fulfilling adequacy grants for other school districts. And so the state could meet its responsibility to fund an adequate education. Hampton is pretty borderline as far as some communities with excess go. It is projected that next year, Hampton will not have any excess swept as a result of increases to adequacy that were written into the state budget that was passed in May of last year. So it can kind of seesaw back and forth whether or not communities have excess swept or don't have excess swept. It can depend on the year. But the vast majority of municipalities in the state do not raise enough with swept to meet the cost of an adequate education. So that's just numbers, but what does that look like in real life? What does adequacy look like in real life? What is that gap between what the state says is adequate and the actual cost of education look like when applied to an actual school district? Excuse me. So we did an exercise with the Allenstown School District, the small district near Concord, asking that very question. Hypothetically, if they had to take their school district budget, which was approved at town meeting by the voters, and cut it down to what the state says they should be able to adequately educate all of its students for, what would that look like? How do we get from the voter-approved, voter-passed $12 million budget to the $2.4 million that the state provides in adequacy aid? We have to cut a lot. There's a lot that gets cut, and you'll probably notice right off the bat that we are violating state law by eliminating all busing. We're violating federal law by eliminating English language learner supports and some special education services. We're firing some custodians, so we're probably breaking locally approved collective bargaining agreements. And this is just a taste, because the list goes on. And it goes on. And I don't want to dwell too long on this, but it's a lot of essentials that you need to run a school. We're not having copiers. We don't have school buses. We don't have school buses. I forget if it's on this slide or the previous one. Yes, it's on this one. We're firing both crossing guards. So there's no school buses and there's no crossing guards for the students to get safely to school. But even by cutting all of these things, we still haven't gotten all the way down to the adequacy budget. As we were doing this exercise, Allenstown decided that they can't control their tuition payment to Pembroke Academy. Allenstown does not have a high school, and because they can't control that line item, they decided to just cut it. So that means an adequate education in Allenstown would conclude at the end of the 8th grade. And even then, we still aren't all the way down. We still haven't made it to adequacy. So the district, they didn't want to cut teaching positions, feeling like that really is the central piece of meeting an adequate education. That's the way the state defines an adequate education, is through the delivery of 11 different subject areas. But we still aren't all the way there. So we're cutting about half the teachers that are left, and we have class sizes that exceed the maximum size allowable by the state. Which I just have to ask that you sit with this question for a second. Does that feel like an adequate education? We have 40 students, almost 40 students in grades 5 to 8 per teacher. And after 8th grade, they aren't going to high school. Is that an adequate education? Clearly, the state is not providing enough money to fund an adequate education if this is what a adequacy-only budget would look like. And that's really where the problem comes in. This over-reliance on local property taxes makes it really difficult for some communities to be able to operate their schools. And it wouldn't be an issue if we had property value and student populations evenly distributed around the state. But that's not how it works in the real world. We have pretty big differences in property value between communities. So this is a pretty simplified example of that, but 40% of town B, the bottom town, having about 40% of the property value of town A on the top is not, that difference does exist in New Hampshire. So here's a simple math problem. Two school districts need to buy new Chromebooks for their students. They're going to buy new laptop computers so that they can have a computer lab class. Town A needs to raise $10,000, sets a $10 per thousand tax rate, and raises that much money. Town B, to set a $10 tax rate, only raises $4,000. The problem is the Chromebook store doesn't care that they have a lower base of property value to draw from. The Chromebooks still cost $10,000. So if Town B wants to be able to buy the Chromebooks, they need to levy a tax rate that is 2.5 times higher than in Town A to raise the same $10,000. And the problem is 3/4 of students and taxpayers live in communities with below average equalized value per pupil. 3/4 of people in New Hampshire live in communities that are being negatively impacted by this system and its reliance on property taxes. Equalized value is a measure of total property value divided by the number of students who live in a community. And it's just a way of measuring how much money there is behind any given, how much money a community has to support its students. The higher equalized value per pupil is, the lower the tax rate they need to set to raise a given amount of money. And I will note that Hampton's equalized value per pupil in 2022, 2023 does not fit on this chart. They were a little over $6 million. So they would be somewhere around the 2 in 235 in the title of that graph. And that plays out in a real way that impacts people's wallets and their personal budgets, their family budgets. So we have two homes here. One of them has all the fixins that you could imagine for a nice home. The other one is smaller, it's older, doesn't have as much space. And I want you to guess which one you think pays a higher property tax bill. And I'm talking into Zoom screen, so I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. But the house on the left, despite being assessed and valued significantly more than the house on the right, pays a lower education property tax bill. Because in Hampton, there's a higher equalized value per pupil, they can set a lower tax rate and raise the same amount of money as Brentwood. Whereas a home in Brentwood has lower equalized value, they need to set a higher rate, which means that even though the home costs less, its education tax bill is higher. And that has a major part in creating a pretty regressive revenue system that we have in New Hampshire. This chart shows what percentage of people's income they pay towards taxes and organized by where they fall on the income spectrum. So the lowest 20% of income earners, they're paying almost 9% of their income to taxes. And as you move to the right and you get wealthier, people are paying a smaller and smaller share of their total income in taxes, in large part because the property tax value, the amount they're paying in property taxes is getting smaller. And this is data from this year from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, ITEP. I'd also like to point out that on here is listed income taxes, including business profits and interest and dividends. The interest and dividends tax is being repealed at, I believe, next year or the end of this fiscal year. And the result of that is that people in the top 5% of income earners are going to see another decrease in their overall tax burden. And the repeal of the I&D tax is going to have no effect on the average tax burden of people outside of the top 5% of income earners. And this starts to have impacts on the education that the students can access. This chart shows average teacher salaries for the last 15 years. And you can see Portsmouth in red at the top, Hampton's in blue, Dover is green, and New Hampshire is the dashed line, the state average. We did a similar budget exercise with the Pittsfield School District a couple years ago as the Allenstown one that I just shared with you. And the Pittsfield superintendent said to us that he feels like he's the minor leagues. He hires great young teachers fresh out of college. He has them work in his schools for 2 or 3 years, and then they leave because they can make 10, 15, 20,000 more dollars per year just down the road in Concord or in Hopkinton or other districts around the state, and make a lot more than they do in Pittsfield. And being able to retain teachers is an important part of maintaining like a stable school community for students. And holding on to the best teachers is a really good way to improve student outcomes. And here, going back to our original example, you can see the difference between Portsmouth and Somersworth. The difference between Portsmouth and Somersworth in terms of their property values. And that has a real impact on the performance of their schools. And I want to say again that obviously these are averages. There are students in Somersworth who achieve higher than students in Portsmouth, that they're hidden by these averages. But on average, this system of high local property taxes is negatively impacting lower property value communities and the students who live there. So something is being done again, which is pretty exciting. There was a new lawsuit filed in 2019 by the Conval School District, which includes Peterborough and 8 other towns in the Monadnock region, which has since been joined by 17 other school districts, including Nashua, where I grew up, and where I still live. And the plaintiff school districts have come to represent about 25% of all public school students in the entire state. Conval sued the state basically as a repeat of the original Claremont decision. They are arguing that the amount that the state pays in base adequacy, and the Conval lawsuit is specifically about base adequacy, they're arguing that base adequacy is insufficient to actually provide an adequate education. And they won. The judge ruled in his decision that the base adequacy cost needed to be increased from, you'll remember, $4,100 per pupil to at least $7,356 per pupil, and no less than that. And the judge noted that that number that he set, 7,356, is probably not even high enough. And also wrote that if the legislature were to simply adopt that number and it showed up in his courtroom again, he would probably find it unconstitutional. And so if you add that up over every student in the state, it's a $537 million increase in state obligation to adequacy compared to what the state is currently paying. So where does that number come from? Mostly for teachers. There's some other support staff that are involved, principals, guidance counselors, librarians, instructional materials. The biggest differences are the ones on the bottom. Currently, facilities, operation and maintenance, there's a little bit of money included in the current adequacy number, which is based on the 2008 legislative study commission that I mentioned earlier. But it's not really enough to pay for electricity and heat and snow removal. Transportation, similarly, currently the state requires that school districts bus students who live more than 1.5 miles from their school, but they don't consider transportation part of an adequate education, and so they don't pay for it. Similarly, the state requires a nurse in all school buildings, and some students would not be able to attend school if there was not a nurse in the building. And yet, the state does not consider nurses to be part of an adequate education. So the judge reiterated that this is a very conservative estimate that he put together based solely on the evidence that was presented during the 3-week trial that happened last year in April and May. And pretty importantly, the state presented no evidence to justify its current adequacy amount. The judge explicitly said the state presented no evidence. We actually, when we saw that, we filed a right to know request with the Attorney General's office to learn how much they had spent on outside counsel. We didn't want to look into what's being spent on salaries in the AG's office because they don't really keep billable hours because they're salaried employees. But the state has spent over $1 million on out-of-state lawyers who presented no evidence in the trial to defend themselves about base adequacy. We are spending $1 million of taxpayer money and not getting any evidence out of it for the purpose of keeping base adequacy at $4,100 per student per year. And so a misconception that has come up a lot around this decision is that this means it has to be $537 million more is being spent on education. But the things that the judge included in base adequacy to get to that $7,356 number are things that school districts are already providing and already paying for with local property tax money. And so a good way to think about it is instead of the pie getting bigger, the pieces are a little bit different. So just by cutting out the additional state adequacy aid, the local property tax burden is reduced by about 12%. We're shifting that revenue from local property taxpayers to the state to have the responsibility of raising that money. Where could that money come from? We could stop the repeal of the interest and dividends tax. We could have a additional true swept, so a swept where all of the revenue is remitted to the state as opposed to retained by local communities. So at about an additional $2 per thousand on swept, we could increase business tax levels to where they were in 2015. The business profits and business enterprise taxes have been regularly cut for the last 7 or 8 years, which has cost the state around $500 million, according to the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. And ultimately, one of the important things to take away from the decision is that the judge is leaving it up to the legislature. Since the first Claremont ruling, the courts have left it up to the legislature to define an adequate education and figure out how they're going to pay for it. And the court, in this instance, has continued to maintain that level of deference. And the state has been sued another time as well. This handsome gentleman here is Steve Rand. He owns a hardware store on Main Street in Plymouth. And he is the lead plaintiff in a group of taxpayers who are suing the state for the non-uniform tax rates. So if you remember the two basic principles that came out of the Claremont decision, that we have to fund an adequate education, that's the Conval suit. And second, that the funding for that adequate education needs to come from taxes that are uniform in rate. It's two sides of the same coin. The Rand lawsuit is the tax side of the coin. And recently, maybe they didn't win on this slide, maybe they won on the next slide. They argue that because local property taxes are used to fund the bulk of the state's obligation to fund an adequate education and they're not uniform in rate, it violates Claremont and the New Hampshire State Constitution. So because we have 70% of school revenue coming from local property taxes, and because those local property taxes vary from $1.50 around in Newcastle to over 15 in places like Charleston, Claremont, and Hopkinton, or that might not be this year, that was last year. That's a pretty big spread in tax rates when they're clearly not uniform. And that money is being raised because the state is not fulfilling its obligation to fund an adequate education. And they're also arguing about differentiated aid, saying that the numbers should be higher than what they currently are. So on this slide, in November, this judge issued decisions in both the Conval and Rand suits on the same day. The Rand decision was just on a specific part of the case surrounding swept. And the judge ruled that retaining excess swept is unconstitutional. The money that is retained as excess is used to offset local property tax, local education property taxes. And as a result of that, communities that have excess swept are paying a lower effective rate on swept, which violates the principle of having uniform rates. They also, the decision would ban negative local education tax rates, which places like, Dick's Notch, I think is where the Balsams is. That's what they use to get around paying swept since they don't have any students. They set negative local tax rates. So the Rand decision is all about fulfilling those constitutional principles that were laid out in Claremont 30 years later. Regular people taking action to get the court to step up and get the state to deliver on the promises that were made in Claremont. So this is kind of starting to wrap up back where we are today. I mentioned the state budget. They increased base adequacy and differentiated aid, and actually saw one of the biggest increases in education funding that has happened in recent history. But as you can see, the little orange piece there is the increase from the most recent state budget. It's a sliver of the actual cost of education. And I think something that's important is Conval and Rand, those plaintiffs are not saying that the state needs to pay for 100% of all expenses that come from schools. They're just saying that the state needs to be paying for a much higher proportion than it currently is to actually help them fulfill the minimum standards and requirements that the state puts on schools, that schools have to follow to be able to operate and educate their students. And very quickly, because I know I've gone a little long, to run through some of the bills that are being discussed this year that are important. HB 1583 was filed by a representative from Peterborough, Jonah Wheeler, who went to Conval schools and filed a bill to increase base adequacy to what the Conval plaintiffs argued it should have been. There was a bill from Representative Cam Kenny to increase special education adequacy grants, and also from Representative Kenny to have the state pay all special education costs. And then HB 1586 would be a pretty comprehensive overhaul of the way we fund education, changes the adequacy formula. It's sort of, I know Representative Myler is here and could do a better job of explaining it than I could, but the main sponsor on that bill is Representative Dave Luno, and it really kind of reimagines the way we fund education in New Hampshire. These bills were discussed in a special subcommittee that was formed by members of House Education, House Finance, and House Ways and Means that Representative Myler is a member of, was a member of the subcommittee. They did a lot of work. They've made some amendments, or they've proposed some amendments that will be voted on by the full Education Committee, I believe, next week. And then the tax reform ones. HB 1686 would basically implement the recent Rand ruling into law by ending negative education property tax rates and would no longer allow excess swept retention. HB 1482 would reinstate the interest and dividends tax, start bringing back about $135 million of revenue a year. And then HB 1422 was voted on in committee yesterday. I actually don't know what happened with it, what the recommendation was, but it was a pretty comprehensive revenue reduction bill. It had cuts to business profits, business enterprise, the communications tax, the rooms and meals tax, and it was, once it took full effect, it would have cost the state almost $400 million a year in annual revenue. Which the state really shouldn't be doing when it has a $537 million that it really needs to be putting up to fulfill the Conval decision. So in summary, and then I'm going to stop and take a deep breath and answer some questions, is that students and taxpayers are not being treated equitably or fairly. The problem's been getting worse since the first Claremont ruling. Over $2 billion is downshifted to local property taxpayers each year, if you add up the gap between adequacy and the actual cost of education, it adds up to over $2 billion around the state. Current system violates the state constitution. And ultimately, the solution lies with state level lawmakers and people like you talking to your lawmakers, making sure this is an important issue, making sure that this is something that state legislatures and candidates running for governor can't ignore, that they have to have an answer when you ask them about school funding. Someone wouldn't run for the state legislature and not have a position on abortion, for example, or gun laws. If you run for office, you're expected to have an opinion about those things. We want to make sure that education funding is on a similar level, that people are well educated, that our legislators understand the importance of this issue, and are giving serious thought to solutions. And what can you do? You can talk to your legislators. You can testify on legislation. You can't testify in person. You can subscribe to our newsletter. We share a lot of tools that you can use to help submit testimony or contact your legislators. We put out stuff on social media. If you'd like to follow us, I can help you write a letter to the editor. Talk to your neighbors. And as a final thought, where students live in New Hampshire shouldn't impact the kind of education that they get. We're a small state. We are, per the Constitution, we are all responsible for the education of all of our students. But in our current system, too many students are not getting the same opportunities as others just because of where they live. And that's something that could easily be fixed by changes to state law, by fulfilling these court decisions that have come down over the last 30 years. And really, I think it's a moral obligation that we have to adequately fund the education for all of our students and ensure that they all have the opportunities to succeed, and be successful individuals later in life. So I do think I went a little long, but that is my last slide. So I'm happy to take any questions that anyone might have.
Noah, excuse me. Thank you so much for an extremely comprehensive review of this very, very, very important issue. You definitely deserve that drink there. Maybe an adult beverage after this will be appropriate also. But that said, I'm going to look to Representative Munns and also Erica DeVries to let us know because I think she's a co-host, to see if we have anything in chat, any questions that have come up. I'm not sure myself if I see them here, but Chris, Erica, we'll see if there are any questions to take.
I think everyone was so engrossed in what Noah was saying that they didn't have time to type in any questions. So there are none in the chat, but if people want to ask a question, you can raise your hand electronically, or you can do it the old-fashioned way and just shout out what your question is. So anybody out there with a question, a thought? I know we have some highly opinionated people on the call, so I'd be disappointed if there weren't some comments.
Chris, I'll get it started with a question just in case others are cooking theirs. Noah, when it comes to the state funding and the adequacy, and that some towns are being disadvantaged, or rather children in some towns are being disadvantaged as compared to other more property tax rich towns, I'm curious what the conversation is that is happening in Concord. Or the towns that are lobbying against the SWEP funding going to contribute to our statewide or our constitutional obligation to provide an adequate education, is that they think that the property, the poorer property tax towns, so less valuable real estate, is there a concern that some towns would be free riders if we share they were designed to do, the SWEPT funding? I'm curious why it is, I guess, at the heart of it, why it is that a town that has excess funds would not want a neighboring town's child to benefit from an adequate education? I'm befuddled by that.
So that's a very good question. And it's one that I think the state has been grappling with since SWEPT did change all those years ago. So people here might be familiar with the term donor town, which was a pretty creative marketing strategy that was developed by these property wealthy communities to lobby the legislature and say, we are donating money to these other communities. They called themselves the coalition communities. There's currently a coalition communities 2.0, which is actively involved in the RAND litigation around SWEPT issues. Hampton is a member of the coalition communities 2.0, although, as I said before, Hampton only has about $120,000 of excess SWEPT that it's retaining and is likely to have zero excess SWEPT in the future. However, the problem really comes from the fact that even though it is a state tax, it's collected on your local property tax bill. And this has always been the case with SWEPT. Instead of getting a separate tax bill from the state that says, here is your state education property tax, and then sending your tax bill to the state, it's just another line item on your local tax bill. So some people don't even recognize that it is a state tax. It has always kind of been treated as a local tax. And so that's why people get this idea that their town is contributing money to other communities. But towns don't pay taxes, property owners pay taxes. It's property owners are the ones who have a responsibility of funding the state's obligation to provide an adequate education. So some of the arguments that have been put forward by the coalition, one of them is that if they had to remit their excess SWEPT to the state, that their local taxes would go up, which is true if they were not using excess SWEPT revenue to offset some of their local education tax rates. Their total tax rate would go up a little bit. However, because their local taxes would go up, they often speak about lower income people who do live in their communities. Just because you live in Portsmouth or Wolfboro doesn't mean you're like incredibly wealthy. But I think a counter to that is there are people in every community in the state who struggle to pay their property taxes. And I think I had it on the slide here. It's there's only 50 communities that have excess SWEPT. 52 municipalities had excess SWEPT last year. But if you add it all up, it's only $26 million of excess that we're talking about. It's not huge sums of money that are being retained or that are, would be going to the state and affecting local budgets. And I think one last point on this question, I think a good comparison is the gas tax. The gas tax is collected at gas stations around the state and is paid out by the state to municipalities to help them fund roads, bridges, that sort of thing. I live in Nashua, couldn't tell you how many gas stations we have. There's a lot of gas stations. Hollis, one town over, I know for a fact there's only one gas station within the town limits of Hollis. Would it sound a little ridiculous if I were to say, well, I don't want any of the money that's collected in Nashua to go to Hollis for their roads? I drive on roads in Hollis a lot. They're our neighbor. I want them to have well-maintained roads so that it is safe for me to drive in Hollis, just like it's safe for me to drive in Nashua. And SWEPT is the only state tax that exists currently that is not treated like a state tax. Are all of the business profits taxes that are collected in Nashua, we have BAE and Fidelity are pretty large employers. They're pretty large payers of the business profits tax. That revenue supports communities around the state. And so I think the arguments that are being put forward by those communities really are coming from a result of, I think, really just poor administration of the SWEPT. The SWEPT is a state tax. It should have always been treated as a state tax. but the state, in its wisdom, left it up to municipalities to collect it and retain it, and that led to this issue to begin with.
We have gotten some questions and we are getting close to the witching hour, so I want to just go through some of these quickly. Molly Allen asked if there is a template for a letter suggesting support for SWEP funding, which could be used to send to legislators. And I'm assuming that maybe that's one of the tools on your website, Noah?
I don't know if we have a tool specifically for that bill at the moment, but I do know that that bill is going to be voted on by the House of Education Committee shortly. Molly, I think I saw Chris put my email address into the chat. If you wanted to send me an email, I could get you a template letter if you would
Great.
like.
Thanks.
And then Donna Siegel asked if you could explain the equalized value calculation again.
Yep. I can let me go back to the yeah. So Donna, do you mean like just how we get the number of equalized value per pupil, or the thing I had about the Chromebooks also?
You said you made a comment about equalized value is higher in some towns, so then they can set the property tax rate lower, but then they still get more. I was just confused at how the math worked.
Yep. Let me.
It's late.
Yes, I know. Let me share my screen again. Just it's a little bit easier for me. Equalized value per pupil is you take the total equalized taxable property value in a community, and then you divide it by the number of students who live there. So it's total taxable property per student. And what I said about having higher property value, being able to set lower rates and raise more money, that's where this example comes in. So if you need $10,000 for new science lab equipment or new computers or new textbooks, or you want to give your teachers a raise, if you have $1 million of equalized value per pupil, you can raise $10,000 with a tax rate of $10 per thousand. But if you only have $400,000 of equalized value per pupil, to raise the same $10,000, you need to have a tax rate of $25,000 per pupil. So the real world examples of this are a place like Newcastle. They have an education tax rate of around $1.50 per thousand, and they're spending over $30,000 per pupil on their elementary school students. In Nashua, we have an education tax rate that's around $10 per thousand, and our total school district expenditure per pupil is closer to $17,000 or $18,000 per pupil. So does that answer your question? Is that a more helpful example?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
So it is 9 o'clock, and I think we probably want to wrap up. Jim, do you want to take us there?
Oh, could I do one more quick thing before I hand it off
Sure.
to Jim?
Yep.
Thank you. So my email address is in the chat. If you have any, I know it's late. If you log off and you wake up in the middle of the night and go, I have a question, send me an email. I'm happy to answer it tomorrow. Subscribe to our newsletter. You can find that on our website if you're interested in staying up to date on the lawsuits and legislation and ways to get involved. And also, we're going to be out on the Seacoast the next 2 weeks. We have an in-person presentation. I have the information here. We're going to be at Hampton Academy on Tuesday next week, the 13th, at 6 p.m. We're doing that presentation in conjunction with SAU 90 and SAU 21. So we always love when we get to work with the school districts on this. And then the following week, we're going to be at Greenland Central School on Tuesday, the 20th at 6 p.m. That event is being done with SAU 50. So we're going to be in your neck of the woods. If you know someone who wasn't able to come, who you think might benefit from hearing about this, or you really enjoyed it and you would like to hear me give this presentation again, but with John Tobin by my side, you can join us in Hampton or in Greenland in the next 2 weeks. And I'd just like to say thank you again for having me and for sharing part of your evening with me. And I hope to hear from you all again.
Noah, thank you so much. And Chris just put up exactly what I was going to end with. The last piece of this series is coming up on February 28th, which you can see on your screen there. So information will certainly be going out about that. But I want to thank everybody who was on this and to continue to encourage everyone to stay involved, to stay engaged. Because we are looking out for the best interest of our children, of our families, of our communities. And as we're working together on these things, we can make a huge difference. So Noah, thank you so much. To the Hampton Democrats and especially Chris Munns, thank you so much for your work. And to that, we will say goodnight, everyone.
And if I,
Thank
Go ahead.
you.
Sorry, we
Oh,
have
yeah.
one final piece of information. Chris may
Sorry.
add to this, but we want to make sure that we have a call to action. What is it that we're supposed to do now that we have this information? Besides being better informed voters, we have many of us, and especially those in Hampton, have municipal elections coming up on March 12th. So our call to action tonight is find out who is running for your school board or school boards. Do the research now. Write letters of support for the good and responsible candidates. Be their advocates. And then, of course, mark your calendars now to vote on March 12th so that we make sure that we get really excellent leaders for our schools. Thank you so much. And Chris, did you have final word?
No, I did. The only thing I wanted to add was that, if you're talking to people and you tell them, what a wonderful presentation this was, again, if you go to the Hampton Democrats YouTube page, you'll be able to watch the previous 3 sessions that we did, and tonight's session should be up there fairly soon. So, don't hesitate to spread the word. And as Erica said, spread the word to get out there and vote on March 12th. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Yep.